Welcome. My name is Kailbeth Chacín, and I will be talking tonight about my research titled Tres Estudios para Violín Solo by composer Miguel Astor, an analysis and application of multimodal tonality and the fusion of Venezuelan folk music in Western European violin performance. Let me tell you first about the importance of this topic in the musical field, especially to those who are not familiar with the Venezuelan repertoire for violin. Often we see many artists programming music that has become traditional of the Western European performance practice, such as Tchaikovsky, Bach, Beethoven, Sarasate, De Falla. Latin American repertoire is getting to be known more and more nowadays, but there are still only a handful of composers who are often programmed, mainly those born in Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. Latin American repertoire, especially the one in Venezuela, my home country, has an extensive list of composers who have been making important additions to the contemporary repertoire, especially during the 20th century. That is how we get to the piece that we are studying today and the composer that we're studying today, Dr. Miguel Astor, and his work, Tres Estudios para Violín Solo, or as it will be translated in English, Three Studies for Solo Violin, which was finished only a year ago in March 2020. My interest in this work started when I discovered that it has all three things that I love the most: Bach solo repertoire, violin, of course, and Venezuelan music. Yes, it does have a great deal of Venezuelan music that I will tell you about soon. And being a work that is so new, there is very minimal scholarship about it and the composer until now. So let's discover first the background of the musical school in Venezuela and how we arrived to the point in history that we are in today. The book La Ciudad y Su Música, or The City and Its Music, by José Antonio Calcaño, is a chronicle of the history of music in Venezuela from the colonial era to the time of this book's first appearance in 1958. The book explains the beginning of the classical and romantic music, as we know it in traditional Western European tradition, in a Caracas that had been conquered by the Spanish and had adopted by the 1700s most of the cultural practices of the Spanish aristocrats. During this period, there were also struggles over slavery and independence. Calcaño makes clear that patriotic songs were composed to encourage the troops to go into the battles and highlight figures such as Simón Bolívar, the liberator of South America. In fact, the Venezuelan national anthem, called Gloria al Bravo Pueblo, or Glory to the Brave People, was composed around that time as well, let's say 1810, more or less. The music is by a disciple of Padre Sojo, Juan José Landaeta, and the text is by writer and journalist Vicente Salias. There was also a movement called La Escuela de Santa Capilla, or the School of the Holy Chapel, integrated by Juan Bautista Plaza, Vicente Emilio Sojo, and José Antonio Calcaño, who we just talked about. Juan Bautista Plaza was the first Venezuelan composer who mixed the Western European music traditions, called música académica in Venezuela, with Venezuelan folk music. The term música académica is used here as the term that defines the music created in academia, which started with the School of the Holy Chapel. He also established the standards for what Venezuelan música académica will become in the following 200 years. Let's see what Maestro Felipe Izcaray, conductor and very important figure and scholar on this topic, said in his doctoral dissertation. Juan Bautista Plaza was constant and persevering in the application of his ideas about the relationship between popular and concert music, which he had expressed already during his school days in Caracas in the late 1910s. He did not quote actual pieces in his own compositions, but made sure the spirit and the character of a specific folk genre or rhythm, such as a joropo, a valse, a canción, were sufficiently evident so as to distinguish a specific composition as a Venezuelan work. That was by Dr. Felipe Izcaray in 1996. Let's talk now later on at the beginning of the 20th century what happened. Izcaray, who we just mentioned, also talks about composers who wrote music for the Orquesta Sinfónica Venezuela, which was the only orchestra at the time in the country, at least in Caracas. Their founding conductor was Vicente Emilio Sojo, who was also a composer and scholar, and was an important figure inside Venezuela's musical history during the 20th century. Several of the composers mentioned in Izcaray's research, such as Modest Tabor, Antonio Esteves, Inocente Carreño, and others, were Miguel Astor's teachers and colleagues whom he knew personally and from whose artwork he drew inspiration to produce his own works. Specifically, Izcaray says in his chapter number 5, he describes the main genres of Venezuelan music that have been influenced by the mestizaje, or mixture of cultures, that came from Western Europe with the Spanish conquest, such as Spanish music, African cultural influences, mixed up with native Venezuelan music, and we got the Viennese waltz as well as that came into the Venezuelan waltz later on, joropo and merengue. These last three are the most common and best known styles of music related today to Venezuela's cultural staples. Here is a commentary made by Juan Bautista Plaza in 1929. The works of a Stravinsky or a De Falla, conceived by and carried out with very modern intentions, but on the basis of national folklore, are a marvel of beauty, of genuine art. Works like those of these authors are the ones that our composers should take as a model. After studying thoroughly all the riches contained in our musical folklore, perhaps less poor than is usually imagined. This affirmation suggests that the modern Venezuelan academic style of music was born in the early decades of the 20th century. The new composers were using French harmonic techniques such as modes, pentatonic scales, planning, chromatism, and dissonances that pushed the boundaries of the tonal system. These styles also look forward to new approaches such as Paul Hindemith's diatonicism and neoclassicism. In an informal conversation with Miguel Astor, the composer, told me that his style has been heavily influenced by Hindemith's works and by Johann Sebastian Bach's counterpoint techniques. It is important to note that Venezuelan music has drawn on various influences from many parts of the world due to the political situation in the first half of the century with the Great War, World War II, and the Soviet Union conflicts. Venezuela received many immigrants from very different backgrounds and cultures, which just enriched the cultural life that was developing in the country, especially after the creation of the Orfeón Lamas and the Orquesta Sinfónica Venezuela in 1930. The musicians of the time also benefited from meeting and sharing the stage with some of the most important figures in the musical world, such as Igor Stravinsky, Sergei Chelevidaki, and Krzysztof Penderecki. Today, in 2021, one can definitely see the importance of these composers and conductors and the repercussions that their works have had over time around the world. Dr. Luis Manuel Fernandez, assistant professor of strings and music education at the University of Wisconsin in Green Bay, wrote in his doctoral essay something that I think is very accurate. He describes the times where Venezuelan composers started experimenting with more avant-garde ideas, such as electronic music and atonality. During the 1960s, a new generation of composers emerged in Venezuela, and they are today contemporaries of Miguel Astor. Some of these living composers are Alfredo Rugeles Azuaje, Paul Decen, Ricardo Teruel, Carlos Duarte, Yanis Ioannidis, Modesta Bor, and Violeta Lares, just to name a few. Let's now talk about Venezuelan folk music meeting música académica in the 21st century. The influence of all the background that I just told you about led to Venezuela to today's vanguardist approach to folklore and the fusion between the classical and the traditional worlds of Venezuelan culture. There were several artistic manifestations during the 20th century, but one of the most important in the contemporary history of Venezuelan music was the contributions made by composer Aldemaro Romero, who invented around 1969 his own style of music called Onda Nueva, or New Wave, with the collaboration of his good friend and percussionist El Pavo Frank. Romero mixed in his music all that he knew was fresh to Venezuela, like jazz and the Brazilian bossa nova, and fused it with Venezuelan joropo. His emphasis was to create a common repertoire where both folk and classical music could coexist, something that really didn't happen before then. In 2004, Romero documented some of his thoughts about the joropo. In this book, he describes the main characteristics of this genre and mentions some of the most important musicians of the time who took part of this one vanguardist movement of musical fusion between the classical and the traditional. Some of these were groups of musicians from the same symphony orchestras that existed in Caracas and that came to light around the same time that Romero invented his new wave. All of these people are the pioneers of the performance of Venezuelan folk music and the Western European tradition mixed. Let's add to that in 1975, José Antonio Abreu founded el Sistema Nacional de Orquestas Infantiles y Juveniles de Venezuela. As it translates in English, the National System of Children's and Youth Orchestras of Venezuela, or better known today as just El Sistema. This social movement has made a significant change to the life of many children over the years who were not able to receive training in classical music. This program made a great chance in the cultural life of the middle to low class Venezuelans, especially to those in poverty, which certainly created had more interest into joining the program and experimenting with new kinds of music. Many of those musicians, and named by Romero, by Romero's book, came from this program, some of whom were my own violin, orchestra, and chamber music teachers later during my school years. Some of the groups had both classical and traditional instrumentations, and that's very important. Here we have a couple pictures of some of them. This one right here, that's El Cuarteto. Up here we have Ensamble Gurrufio. We also have mentioned in the book Grupo Arcano and Saul Vera and Ensamble. These groups represented the beginning of many other groups and artists who decided to fuse their passions for folk and Western European tradition, folk music from Venezuela and Western European tradition, such as violinist Alexis Cárdenas and his group Recoveco, Tocuyito Trio, who are currently in Europe, C4 Trio, the neo-folklore movement liderized by Huáscar Barradas and Rafael Pollo Brito, and the movida acústica urbana during the 2010s. One can say that now Venezuela is gaining recognition not only because of tourism and gastronomy, but mainly because of the culture that is now being taken beyond the borders to be globalized. Many of these groups and musicians are now all over the world, mainly performing and producing music and creating content that has always a little of folk music in it. To remind the listener, in the first place, and the player as well, where they come from, and show a little bit of that nostalgia. It is my hope that with this research that I have conducted, I will expose some of that heritage of which I, as a Venezuelan musician myself, am very proud. Let's talk now about who are we studying here. Composer Miguel Astor. He was born in Caracas, in Venezuela in 1958, started his musical studies taking guitar lessons with Melchor Centeno, later did studies in choral conducting with Alberto Grau. Here we can see his higher education degrees, Bachelor of Arts in Musicology from Universidad Central de Venezuela, Master of Science in Latin American Musicology from same institution in 2000, PhD in History, Universidad Central de Venezuela in 2003, and a Magister Atrium from University of Costa Rica in 2003 that was awarded to him. Some of his mentors have been Modesta Bor, Violeta Lares, Primo Casale, Alberto Grau, Yanis Ioannidis, Boris Cerdos, Federico Ruiz, Alfredo Almónaco, and Antonio Mastro Giovanni. A higher education professor he's been a higher education professor, at several important universities in Venezuela, such as the Escuela de Artes, Universidad Central de Venezuela, Universidad Nacional Experimental de las Artes, which I attended, Conservatorio de Música José Ángel Lamas, which is the current name of the place where the School of the Holy Chapel started, and the Escuela de Música Pedro Nolasco Colón. His catalog of compositions has a considerable number of works that include hymns, choral music, music for piano, guitar, chamber music, symphonic, choral symphonic music, and also now we can add his new composed solo etudes for several solo instruments. He doesn't identify as a nationalist, but an eclectic composer, given the fact that several of his works are thought and conceived with a different language and innovative texture. Let's see what Astor means about not being a nationalist. Differently from the nationalism that wanted to become universal in the 50s in Latin America, the Venezuelan element of my music is simply a reflection of who I am as an individual, of the place in the world where I have grown up, of my customs and traditions. As such, I don't separate them either from my relationship to the cosmopolitan and universal, if you will. He also has developed his own music theory, and he has provided me with the paper, the research paper about it, called Tonalidad Multimodal, or multimodal tonality. According to Astor, and the research paper he provided me with, he defines multimodal tonality as an amplification of the major and minor tonal system. Astor's style of music is categorized as a polar or central language, meaning that the tonality is based on open modes, not just major and minor, which are considered closed modes. Astor's influences are Paul Hindemith for his style and textures, but also Bela Bartok for his usage of the folk elements, and Jaime Pajiza, who was a Spanish composer and created something very similar called intertonalism. According to Asenjo, intertonalism consists of the simultaneous play of independent voices in continuous modulation according to the laws of attraction and tonal proclivity of diatonic harmony. What does that mean? Basically, in easy terms, Jaime Pajiza defined himself as being in all tones at all times. Astor applies multimodal tonality to his music by having the freedom to choose one key or tonality and alternating the notes in any way possible: sharp, flat, diminished, augmented, except the first and the fifth degrees of said key. For example, let's make an exercise. Let's imagine that we are in the key of C major. If we use Astor's theory of multimodal tonality, we can create a modal sense in the music without disrespecting the key of C major. Here we see, Here we see that we have the first degree of the scale, C, or Do, and then we have the fifth degree of the scale, Sol, or G, and the rest of the notes can be altered anyway. So, how does that exactly go? Here we see the sheet music of Astor's Estudio en Do para clarinete y piano, or study in C for clarinet and piano. And in this case, it's B flat clarinet, and it's written in concert pitches. This piece is an example of the possibilities that can be reached with this theory. This small piece shows a well-grounded tonal center of C, or Do, where one can find also room for a half step, augmented fourth intervals, etc. That gives the piece the modal characteristic, and also sets up the freedom for the composer to work on any harmony that he might want or she might want to have in their composition. The piece you will hear tonight, Tres Estudios para Violín Solo, is not to be confused with the known or with the term etudes. The term study is used instead to make clear that these three movements are not meant exclusively to work on a specific aspect of the violin technique. They are meant to be an exploratory experience for the composer. So let's discover what this piece is about. Tres Estudios para Violín Solo has three movements. The first movement, called Preludio, is the movement that has the most connection with the multimodal tonality theory. The movement that has a G tonal center and contains a chorale section that has a grand amount of dissonances, whole tones, semitones, major and minor thirds that will be played both melodically and harmonically, thanks to the counterpoint written by Astor. Did the composer use any quotes from Bach? The composer didn't make direct quotes of Bach, but definitely has passages where there's an allusion to Bach. Let's remember that Astor emulates the textures and not the harmonic patterns of Bach. So here I have a comparison of a couple spots where in both the Partita number 3 by Bach and the first movement of Tres Estudios para Violín Solo, the Preludio, you can relate them to. That was Bach. Now let's listen to what Astor wrote. As you could hear, Astor imitates the voice movement that Bach's prelude and could see the similarity between the melodic lines as well as the mixture with the open string pedal. Astor uses fragments of modes and scales in several places of the movement as melodic material for the Preludio. For example, in the very beginning of the piece, at measure 4, Astor displays a full scale in D minor to end the first half of phrase. This is the first time in the piece that there is a sense of tonality in the music. A chorale then happens at the lento section that changes the mood of the movement drastically. This section is similar to Bach's lyrical sections in his Sonata number 1 in G minor, but the difference is that is made again by the harmonic changes and the interval usage. I am going to play a little bit of it for you. Remembering now that the multimodal tonality theory, what it does, this section matches with what Astor says, that, and I quote, the modality can be expanded through the alterations of the diverse grades of the scale. Then there is a cadenzal-like passage that follows this chorale section to arrive to a false recap, to give the performer and the listener a sense of form that can be related to the traditional practices of Western European composers. Astor also wrote this with the intention to showcase technical practices of the violin, of course, like bow strokes, such as jeté, or to end with the passage that has the same feel of a coda section, where the main theme is recalled in a closing manner. Let's now talk about the second movement of this piece, the Fuga. Inspired on Bach's Sonata number 2 in A minor, specifically in its second movement, the fugue, and the partita number 2 in D minor, specifically its most famous movement, the chaconne. This movement is written in 3/4 like the chaconne, and it also begins in D minor. Astor adds the element of folk music in his Fuga by mixing it with the Vals Venezolano. This style of music, inherited from Western Europe due to the Spanish colonization, gave a platform in later years to the development of a fusion between Venezuelan folk music rhythms and the traditional European waltz, written in 3, where the first beat is the strongest of all in the measure. It is important to note that the stress of the beats are different between the chaconne and the fuga. Bach uses the second beat of the measure as the stress point of it, very similar to what happens and the strong beat placement of the saraband dance. Unlike Bach, Astor emphasizes the first beat more like the Vals Venezolano and the Western European waltz. The mixture of ternary rhythms in one voice and binary rhythms in another is what makes this genre different from the traditional Viennese waltz. Venezuelan music in general is rich in syncopated rhythms. That is the case of the hemiolas that are present in the subject theme of the fuga. One should expect the motifs to appear in several places of the movement, and is based on 3 major tonal centers. It goes first in D, then it switches to C, and then it goes back to D. And is directly related to the different interludes that the movement has. Here's a little excerpt from the Fuga written by Astor. So now we continue to talk about the third movement, the Pajarillo, or if you translate it, little bird. The third and final movement of Tres Estudios para Violín Solo is called Pajarillo. The Pajarillo is a variant of a traditional genre called joropo. This genre has very different variants, depending on the region that you're in. Joropo is also performed in Colombia, and I know this is going to be controversial with my Venezuelan and Colombian friends, but hear this out. And it is similar to the Venezuelan joropo, the one in Colombia, but but the joropo llanero is defined also by Dr. Melissa Melendez, professor of viola at Texas A&M University in Corpus Christi, Texas. She defines it as a style of music that is known to provide repeated patterns. Those are characteristics of folk music. Syncopations, hemiolas, and displacements of the beat that help the composer to create tensions. The typical pajarillo starts with a simple bass-led set of chords in D minor that highlight the notes that are traditional of such genre. Here we can see that we have the main bass line. I'm gonna pluck it a little bit for you. And that second to last chord is also accompanied with a seventh. It's very interesting. Astor writes these notes in the very first measure of his Pajarillo. The chaconne, written by Bach, is in D minor, and based on a main theme that is varied throughout the piece. Excuse me. The harmonic pattern of the joropo, 1-4-5-1, is respected in each variation. In the case of Astor's Pajarillo, and in contrast to the prior two movements, the third and final study stays within the parameters of tonality, meaning that the multimodal elements are not present. Regarding the form of this movement, it is, I can say that it is written in what I have chosen to call a non-symmetrical arch form. Why do I say this? Here we see that we have A, B, C, and it's pretty consistent in the amount of measures that we have, and it goes all the way to J. And then it starts repeating prima versions of material that we already saw or heard. In this case, it's not being repeated like a normal arch form, A, B, C, B, A, and that's why I'm calling it non-symmetrical. Astor's Pajarillo is also technically demanding. Each variation showcases a specific type of technique, such as ricochet, harmonics, double stops, string crossings, pizzicato, left hand pizzicato, sul tasto, sul ponticello, spiccato. For this one, I want you to enjoy it when you hear the performance. Let's talk now about the performance edition findings. I received this piece back in March 2020 sent by the composer for revision, and I ended up taking it as a research project. And I wanted to make sure that the correct usage of different bow strokes and the extended techniques that are in the music were going to give the piece life and meaning within the mixed musical style of the academic music that we just talked about and traditional Venezuelan music. So the piece didn't have any fingerings or bowings, and because the composer is not a violinist himself. So I had the challenge and the exciting project of fingering and bowing this piece. The process of fingering and bowing it, all three movements actually, as well as analyzing the best ways to approach specific passages, were all meant to make justice to the musical ideas of the composer, and at the same time add the necessary indications for other non-Venezuelan violinists to play this piece in the best way possible, and not being so difficult for them to understand, and it keeping the whole concept of traditional music as well if they are not familiar. So one challenge that I have found about the work as a performer was actually the multimodal tonality element. The composer writes a traditional form that has been represented for approximately 500 years, but adds harmonies that are not present in the early ages, of course. such as tritones, minor and major seconds, as well as sevenths, that are not usually expected to appear so often or next to each other. The composer also uses very often the resources to modulate to any key or mode at any time, just applying his theory. So in working on these fingerings, for these movements, I encountered several places where I found myself shifting positions every measure to play accurately. But at the same time, I also found myself searching for easier and more feasible ways to approach the passages. I must say that the fingerings provided in the final performance edition, that I hope it's available for whoever wants to play it very soon, that these fingerings are, to me, at least personally, the best option I could find, that will not affect the musician's performance and will keep present the style of music, the style of playing of this music. So that being said, I want to thank you for listening. Here's my email for you to email me any questions that you would like to send me. Now, I will take just a couple minutes to thank all the faculty at Shenandoah University. It has been an honor and a pleasure performing and learning from all of you, especially to my professor Akemi Takayama and the search committee, Dr. Stokes, Dr. Laurie McManus, Professor Jan Wagner. I will be forever grateful. With that said, please enjoy the performance, que disfruten el concierto. No olviden escribirme sus preguntas. Mil gracias.